Somebody can finish my nachos. I mean, who goes out to speak somewhere and orders nachos? Anyway, yeah, not very smart. This is, however, the very first time that I have spoken publicly in jeans. So you can consider yourselves honored with my casualness today. Thank you. I figured a pub, jeans would be okay. So anyway, it's an honor to be here, and we have been corresponding for some time. So it is great to be able to come and spend some time with you. This is a really challenging week because this is the week that the decision about me is going to be shared. And so I'll talk about that a little bit. But before I get to that, I want to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I'm an atheist in the United Church, why that makes sense to me or has made sense to me up until quite recently, and why it seemed like the normal thing to do, and why I thought it was very important to do in the United Church. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about religion and some of the things about religion that I think are crucial to community, and another reason why I stayed in the United Church of Canada. And then I'll talk a little bit about the current situation. But I don't want to talk for very long. I'd rather say what I have to say in a concise little way and then ask you to ask me what you want me to talk about, right? Because I'm a preacher, right? I could talk for hours and never touch on anything that is of any interest to you, which I think is what most preachers do. So I'll get through some of the sort of background stuff, and then I'll ask you for your questions. So just keep them under wraps for the first little while, and then we'll go from there. So in order to explain why I'm a minister in the United Church of Canada, I really need to give you a little bit of a history lesson about the United Church. And bear with me. It's not gripping, but it's important. The United Church came into being in the early 20th century, 1925. Already, like in 1890 and in the early 20th century, there was a lot of controversy welling up because The Quest of the Historical Jesus had been written by Albert Schweitzer in 1904, I think. In the 1890s, theological colleges were looking at the historical Jesus. They were bringing new tools to explore the Bible and coming up with like much more rational understandings about the Bible and its authorship, who wrote it, when they wrote it, why they wrote it, who they wrote it for, all of that stuff. So that was all coming to the fore in the late 19th century. At the same time, of course, because that was coming to the fore, there was this rise in evangelicalism, a rise in miracles and all of that to counter some of that understanding. And the United Church was born in the middle of those waves that were crashing against each other at that time. Its articles of faith, the statements of doctrine, were written in about 1908, but the denomination didn't come together till 1925, and it was the Presbyterians, half of the Presbyterians, they fought about it, so about half of them came in, the Methodists, and the Congregationalists, who were originally Church of England Anglicans, but dissenters. So they're preparing for union, and you can imagine it takes a long time to negotiate these things. That's the jalapenos. And coming up to union, one of the most crucial things was that statement of doctrine that was written in 1908, because it didn't match the statements of doctrine that anyone who was ordained in one of those other denominations had agreed to when they were ordained. And they wanted their doctrine to come into union, but of course they didn't agree on doctrine, so they couldn't put it all into one statement. So rather than trying to cut and paste all the different doctrines and put them together in what would have been a total mess, one of the dissenters, one of the people from the Congregational Church, decided, well, why don't we just say that everybody coming into union has to be in essential agreement? Like, they don't have to believe everything. So if their understanding of, the nature of God was slightly different when they were ordained, they would still be able to embrace what it said in the Articles of Faith of the new Union Church, because they could say they were in essential agreement. So that's a key piece of history in the United Church. And it was meant for the people who came in, who are already ordained coming into union. But the thing is that essential agreement became really crucial for everybody that was ordained after union. Its power was seen once the United Church started ordaining clergy. Because that questioning of the Bible and who Jesus was and the nature of God, that didn't stop, with the writing of that doctrine and the cementing of it in the basis of union. It continued on. And those people who wrote it and the ones who came together, they started working within 10 years on a new statement of faith that was embraced in 1940. But once they started ordaining clergy into the United Church of Canada, a clergy person only really had to be in essential agreement. And a committee would decide what that was. So you'd have a committee in, no growing Saskatchewan, looking at what a candidate for ordination's beliefs were, and they would hear what the person had to say, and they'd say, yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, that's okay. And so the person would go and get ordained, and they'd answer all the ordination questions. And someone in, the Maritimes would go, and their committee might hear something completely different and say, I'm good with that. Are you good with that? Yeah, I'm good with that. Okay, great. So you can be ordained too. So the United Church ended up getting this incredibly diverse theology within the people in its leadership and the people in the pews. But one of the things that happened in the 1890s and on into the early 20th century was that there was this split in understanding of theology. So if you went to theological college and you studied, you would be, with a whole lot of people that were talking about theology at one level. But the people who were in the pews, you needed to treat them pastorally. So the idea became very common that you didn't actually tell them everything that you learned in theological college. You didn't want breakdown, right? So you would couch your words, and you'd use the word God, even though it might mean something very different to you than it might mean to someone in your pew. And I think that's been one of the biggest dangers that we've had, because we have a very well-trained clergy in the United Church of Canada. When I went to theological college in the 1980s, no one tried to teach me how to improve my relationship with God. I did not go to school to deepen my relationship with God. I went to school to wrestle with concepts of God as they had been articulated by a whole lot of people, and to figure out what my concept of God meant too. So my husband, who is a former evangelical, he went to school and he learned how to deepen his relationship with God. Two totally different understandings. And so when I came out of my theological education, my New Testament textbook was by William Countryman. It was called Dirt, Greed, and Sex, which was all about what the Hebrew Scriptures were about, purity laws and sexuality and property, right? Dirt, greed, and sex. And my New Testament, or my church history book was the Gnostic Gospels, which was really about how different emergent Christian communities were trying to kill each other off, right? And so the whole development of the early church wasn't really just as lovely as we were led to believe. It was actually a political slaughterhouse. So those are the kinds of things that I learned when I was at theological college. And I emerged with an understanding of God that was very, elastic. It could change and move. And, the thing about consciousness raising, though, is that it's plastic. Once you raise your consciousness about something, it doesn't go back. There's no elasticity around consciousness, right? So once you become aware of something like that, you can't change it. So most of us at theological college, many people came in with very traditional beliefs. At the end of their first year, they were, jelly in the corner. And over the course of the next couple of years, you put all of that together. So that the leadership in the United Church of Canada has been predominantly a well-educated leadership. And they have ministered in pastoral ways. So those two tracks of theological discourse, the track that is academic and the track that is pastoral, have continued to widen these many decades, because we have not sat down with people in our pews and shared with them the fact that we're not really going to help them deepen their relationship with God, with a personal God. Until about the 1960s. In 1960, in the 1950s, the United Church started trying to close that gap. It began work on a curriculum, a Sunday school curriculum, the intention of which was to take academic understanding and share it with the people in the pews, and to do it in a pastoral way, right? So that you didn't kill everybody. You were able to just tell them what you knew and help them grapple with that reality. That started in 1952. I was born in 1958. That was the year that they actually came up with exactly what they wanted to do with that curriculum. And in 1964, the first book, The Way and the Word, was published. Donald Mathers was the author of that. And that was probably my first year in Sunday school. So my Sunday school experience was exploring very radical, what would have been radical theology at that point in time. I was taught that God was a feeling, it was about love, it was about creating beauty in the world. Jesus was this guy who lived a long time ago, did some cool things, might be able to teach me a few lessons with some of the stories he told. And the Bible was a collection of stories, right? It wasn't the divine authoritative word of God. I never learned about a judgmental God who was a being who lived in heaven. So when I was a child and through my theological education, I was able to engage a very progressive understanding of God. In 1964, 12 years after the United Church had begun the work of wanting to bring the stories of academic theology to the people in the pews, John A.T. Robinson, the Bishop of Woolwich in London, published a book called Honest to God. And that book kind of shook the foundations of people in the pews and was in the back pocket of a lot of clergy who, because of that book, felt that they could stay in the church. Because he was really saying, we need to get real with our people. We need to tell them the truth, that God is not up there or out there, and if we even got rid of that word for a generation, it wouldn't be too soon. We should do that. C.S. Lewis at the time, who is known for his, Christian imagery in his works and his Christian beliefs, Pashad, John A.T. Robinson, suggested that he wasn't saying anything new. We all know this. And even today, when in the controversy that's going on in the United Church with me, a lot of my clergy friends are going, nothing that Gretta is saying is new. Like it's so boring and passé, and why is she even saying it? But the truth of the matter is that we have held that still closed in our little clergy circles, and we have not shared it with people in the pews. Okay. So that's my background, and that's why I consider myself, a legitimate heir of the United Church of Canada, and someone who was raised by it, taught by it, nurtured by it, encouraged by it, and now threatened by it. But it has been a journey that has been undertaken under its wing, very much under its wing and under its tutelage. So now let me flip to why I think religion is important. This is probably not the crowd for that, but there are a few things that religion does that I think are extremely important, and I think the United Church has been doing them for a very long time. There's a guy, and I can't remember his name now, but he talks about 5 trans things that religion does. One is it transmits our heritage and the things that are important to us. It transmits, the values that we have. It transmits ritual and symbol that help us recognize who we are and identify us as a group. And that, obviously there's no set of symbols or set of rituals that's right for any single and for humanity, because it's divvied up amongst countless numbers of religious traditions. But to identify yourself as a member of a group is a significant and important part of being human and feeling safe and confident where you are. So transmitting the symbols and the ritual and the language of a group of people is an important thing. That translates life into meaning. It translates what's going on in your life. Religion can help you figure out what that's about. That's the idea. That it helps you make sense of your world. So it translates everyday experience into something that has a broader meaning. You're not just getting up and, racing your way out the door and coming home and going to sleep again. There's some purpose in life, right? So let's talk about that. What can I make out of my life to give it some purpose and some meaning? It doesn't necessarily have to exist out there the way religion has always said that it has, but religion has done that. It's allowed us to translate everyday experience into meaningful experience. It helps us transcend some of the stuff that goes on in our lives because we make that meaning out of it. And so it becomes something different, something that can help us move beyond just the everyday tragedies and sorrows that we bear, that some of us carry for decades with us, helps us transcend them. There's a couple of other ones in there too. But the work that I did when I was doing my book, Amen, which is a book on prayer, and it should have been titled With or Without Prayer, We're All the Answer We've Got. But the publisher wouldn't go with that. When I was doing it, there was some other work that was coming out at the same time about religious community. Many of you will know Robert Putnam, who wrote the book Bowling Alone. He's a sociologist in the States. He and another researcher, Shayoon Lim, did some work around that meme that if you belong to a religious community, you have a better quality of life. better well-being, right? And we've heard that, we've read about it in the newspapers. And they wanted to dig into that. What is that about? Like, why, if people are part of religious communities, why do they have a better sense of meaning in their lives? Why do they do better? Why are they healthier? Why do they live longer, for heaven's sakes? So they started digging into that. And what they found was that it had dick all to do with beliefs. Didn't matter how well you believed, like how fervent a believer you were. It was related to how often you went to church and how often you connected with people. So if you went to church once a week and then you got together with, a craft group on Tuesday evenings and you sang in the choir, you got together on Thursday, the number of contacts you made with that community, your well-being would go from just, like Barbara Fredrickson has that number. At some point it flips from just getting by to flourishing. And if you are connected with a community like that, you flourish when you connect intentionally and regularly and build relationships that matter. So where is that with the United Church and where I am now? I think that that's a crucial piece, that the United Church actually has abdicated some of its responsibilities. Because I think the United Church had a lot to do with the social democratic world that we live in as Canadians. The United Church tempered a lot of those conversations that might have flown off the evangelical end, or might have, ended up in, a libertarian society where no one feels safe. The United Church brought those conversations forward and challenged the government, challenged communities, challenged the people sitting in its pews to have those meaningful conversations, and so to enter into the important debates of the day. And in the 1950s and 1960s, when it was still growing alongside immigration, which is what has always fed the growth of religion in Canada, it had a pretty big voice. Some of its biggest leaders went on to spend years in government, and we had a significant amount of influence. But the numbers started dropping after that. We went into this Sunday school curriculum. The Baptists actually marched on Church House when that came out because they were so angry. And then we started this waltz with the Anglican Church. We were going to try to connect with the Anglican Church, but that forced us into this sort of liturgical thing, which was new to us. And I think the United Church kind of lost its way. It stopped being and doing some of those democratic things that it had done in the past. It did, however, continue to do the radically social stuff that it had done before. The ordination of women in the 1930s, which was the first church in Canada to do that, allowing married women to be ordained, allowing divorced clergy to stay in the pulpit, allowing all kinds of, taking the first step of many churches, the ordination of gays and lesbians in the late 1980s, and same-sex marriage in the early 2000s. So we've always been keeping up on those kinds of things. But somewhere along the line, we chickened out on that curriculum that came out in the 1960s. That curriculum was only published between 1964 and 1971. And in 1971, when the United Church and the Anglican Church published a hymnal together, and then both of them looked at it and went, oh my God, we can't join with them, because they hated our music, we hated their music, and that sort of split it up. But we had this titillating experience about liturgy, and the United Church decided, rather than continuing that very uncomfortable conversation that had been begun with that Sunday school curriculum, which had got a lot of people pissed off, rather than continuing that conversation, we'll go in this direction, and we enriched this liturgical movement. We could still keep the language about God, we could create mystery, we could bring candles and colors and all kinds of liturgical responsive readings and stuff into, and that took the place of the meaningful debate that the United Church was having. And I think what happened is that paralleled what? It paralleled the embrace of reality beyond a worldview that was dictated by religion. In the 1970s and the 1980s, that worldview was falling away quickly. And it has only fallen away more and more quickly every year. In 2009, I went to West Hill in 1997. I've been there since 1997. in 2001, I did a workshop around my presbytery on core values and core beliefs, and I learned that most of the people in the United Church pews still had that my Sunday school curriculum understanding of Christianity. So they still knew that Jesus kind of died maybe for my sins, wasn't quite sure what the sins were, thought that when we died we went to heaven to be with God, where we'd all be reconciled. Like, it was very standard traditional understandings, which surprised me, right? Because I got up every Sunday and told them something else. Didn't I? So I went back to my congregation trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. How did they walk away from a Sunday service still thinking that I believed in heaven, earth, and hell, and that Jesus was this, divine Son of God that had saved everyone? How could they possibly walk away from one of my services and believe that? The next Sunday, and we had sort of come to an awareness of that, the guy that had done the workshop with me. The next Sunday, I picked up the bulletin in the service and looked at it and went, oh, there it is. All the hymns, all the prayers, all the liturgy, all the psalms, everything that was included in there reinforced that worldview. Only the 20 minutes that I preached, I had to use a Bible passage, so I'd take the Bible passage, I'd explain to you why, it didn't have any bearing on our current world, because it was written by somebody in a certain socio-political context who was trying to get a point across to these kinds of people. And, so I would deconstruct the whole thing, and then I'd say, so it has no bearing on today. And then I'd pick something up and say something meaningful. But nobody got it, because I wrapped it all in this, gift wrap of songs that talked about God's grace and Jesus' salvation and, the whole, triumph across the nations. Why I didn't see that before, I have no idea. And I was troubled, but I didn't know what to do about it. So for about 8 to 10 weeks, I can't remember how long, I did nothing about it. In the meantime, one of my colleagues had his 2-year-old son torn from his arms in a hurricane and killed. And the newspaper that next morning had a picture of a mother and a father and a child, and the headline, "God took care of our family." And that just added to the angst that I was going through. And so in 2001, I preached a sermon. I got to the church one day without a sermon, and I just spontaneously took God apart completely. So I don't believe in this. I don't believe in an interventionist God. I don't believe in a God of a presence. I don't believe any of this. And then I sat down and had to get up and do the intercessory prayers, which was a bit awkward. But what happened after that is the extraordinary part of this story. Because after that kind of a sermon, most congregations would just let their minister go, right? And I went to the board and we had that conversation. And the board said, well, that sounds interesting. Really? Yeah, and they said, what would it look like if we actually did, if we did that here? And I said, I have no idea what it would look like. But they had the courage to say, well, let's find out. Let's find out. And so that group of people began that journey. Now, 7 years later, when we removed the Lord's Prayer from the service, many of those people left the church and went to another church. But that's another part of the story. But the truth of the matter is that this was a brave group of people who wanted to explore beyond the beliefs that divide. And they wanted to take what they believed was the United Church's heritage, protect it, and do what religion is supposed to do, transmit that most important thing to the next generation. So what is that most important thing that we transmit? It's a belief that the world is an extraordinary place, and that each person in it has an extraordinary gift to give, whatever that is. I mean, we figure that out in our lives. We train ourselves, We dance at some point when we're a child, and everybody says, that's the most beautiful dance I've ever seen, and we end up being a dancer. I don't know how it happens, but we have these gifts that we nurture and grow and develop, and we have the opportunity to give them into community. And isn't it sad that we don't still, the United Church doesn't still nurture communities that celebrate and invite you to do that. That's my lament, that the United Church doesn't still do that. Okay, we're going to stop for a second so we can reboot